Hello once again, everyone, and welcome back to our returning series for 2022. It is Moveset Breakdowns once again. I took a long break from this series, but I decided to return to it. I'm going to try and do maybe one or two of these a month to sort of space it out and also give myself a little more time to work on them. But as you might have seen from the title, I'm going to be going over the knife and bayonet takedowns from Battlefield 1. And joining me today is Randy. And the reason I wanted to go over these is, one, they've always kind of been on my mind, and two, because I recently got to see the Kingsman movie, and I was like, okay, let's do something trench involved. But what I find really interesting about these animations in particular is twofold. Number one, they're directional, meaning I can come against Randy in 4 different directions, from his right side, his left side, front, and back, and there is a slightly different animation for every single one, which I appreciate that level of detail, as it does give a lot of variety. And number two is that there is a sort of emphasis that ends up being noticeable, at least in the knife and the bayonet use, that I really think is quite cool. So let's talk about what that emphasis is. First off, most of the knives that you're going to see that are used in this category are relatively small, only about the size of this trainer I have here, be they the trench knives, be they the Boker knives or anything, or survival knives, anything along those lines. They're pretty small, even if they have a knuckle guard, and they're relatively thin bladed. We're not talking about big bowies or the Welsh blades or anything like that. Those fall into a different category, which I may tackle some other time. But these small fighting knives, when it comes to their use, what I think is really cool is that this set of animations is relatively true to life in regards to, even though Randy is flesh and blood, he's not wearing armor, he has natural armor, be it his bones, where the fatal parts of him are located, because one stab from this, unless it's placed correctly, probably isn't going to put him out of commission, and I can't afford to have that sort of time, so there is that emphasis on aiming for weak spots. And if you want to look more into this, just look at any of Fairburn Sykes or Rex Applegate's work in regards to using fighting knives, because that becomes a whole different world. So I really kind of appreciate that there is this emphasis put onto it. Now, it's not one for one, and I couldn't find any specific historical references for this focus, but there is a noticeable focus, and that being I want to try and get my dominant side thrust onto the heart as soon as possible. If I can't, then I'm going to upset another area and then work my way in. So let's go ahead and go over them kind of in order. So Randy's going to be at the at-ready position, as he would as just an idle person in the game. Now, obviously, if I'm at this distance, I'm dead, right? He shoots me and he keeps on going, right? Most of these animations are you're either already relatively close and then you play your animation, or you're coming up to someone from when they're not expecting. So we'll go ahead and start with the rearward. So I've managed to get behind Randy and I start coming up. The way this is going to work is I'm going to approach. I'm going to put my left hand on his shoulder as my right hand comes over the top. Now, in the animations, whenever you get this kill animation started, the opponent just kind of lowers their gun and looks all terrified. Obviously, that's not realistic, but it doesn't really matter. Point being, though, I come up, I put my left hand on the shoulder, and I draw him back into that thrust onto the chest. Then I just ditch him straight backward and keep going. Relatively straightforward. I'm getting a very powerful thrust. I'm holding him and slightly pulling back into it. The other nice thing about this is it makes it relatively difficult for him to turn around and fight me. They don't put a ton of emphasis on what this hand is doing, if it's pulling or something along those lines. I personally like to treat it as I'm sort of grabbing his shoulder and opening him up, kind of dropping him onto his backside, and then taking that gravity thrust from above. But one more time on that one. Randy's shooting, having a good time. And we're done. Now the next one we're going to tackle is from the front. So for this, Randy's going to face me. Now, again, if I'm here, that's different, right? So we're going to assume that by the time you're pulling your knife out, you're at this distance. But either way, the way this one works is I'm going to lead with the knife, and it's going to be, again, a thrust into the heart, relatively straight line, and the hand is going to come up and just kind of hold them almost, kind of assist with me driving that in. So again, I'm going to come up, and I'm going to drive the knife in, and I'm going to then twist it around a little bit, back out, you pretty much just drop straight down. This one I think is the weakest of all the knife takedowns, but you're approaching from the front. I would have maybe liked to see a little bit of handwork or something along those lines to lead into it, or heck, even just something to upset him before driving the knife, or maybe nice stomp to the balls thing. But it still works for our purposes. So let's see it again. I've already gotten close. Lead with the knife, twist, we're out. Now we start getting into my favorite ones, which are from the side. So we'll start off with Randy's right side. For this one, because I'm once again set up to have that reach for my dominant side thrust, and all of these are going to be done in sword grip. You're not going to see any ice pick grip at all. We'll talk about that again in a moment. For this one, this is one of the more brutal ones. Again, he's going to come up and he's going to lead with the knife. Now you could thrust, again, their hands always drop, but my target looks a lot more from below, if his hands didn't drop or what have you. But either way, I come up, I get my thrust in, I'm going to grab with the left hand, and rather than just ripping it back out, we're actually going to lift up, sort of putting it like the first one again. Then we're going to pull it back out. So kind of a similar theme in regards to the one from behind, we tilted him up. The one from this side, we tilt him up. And then the other two are kind of flip sides of each other again as well. But once again, I come up, lead with the knife, get that thrust in, twist, we're out. Now this one, probably my favorite, because it shows finally a change. So what the consistent has been is every time I'm trying to go for his heart with my dominant side thrust. But when I approach him on his left side, again, we don't see any ice pick grip use. There's no real good way for me to get a powerful thrust in against Randy's heart, and that's my best way for dropping him. So instead what we see here is when you approach from the left side, you're going to lead with a kidney stab, and this is meant to kind of disorient, upset him. It ends up with him dropping to a knee. He turns to look at you, you pulled your arm back, and you just follow through with a nice hard strike, using either your knuckle bow or in this case your bare hand, but you know, bare face. This one I like because it shows difference, and we're going to see that more in the prone animations. I can't get my dominant target. I think the neck is still plenty open, but for whatever reason. So instead I follow with the kidney, I get that thrust in, get him upset, put as much power as I can into that follow-up hit, and then just move on. So, those are all the standing animations, and they're pretty cool. Like I said, there's an emphasis on getting to the heart, and when we couldn't get to the heart, we instead upset with a kidney stab. Now we're going to see that again in regards to attacking prone opponents. So, Randy's going to take a nice prone position. Now for this, once again, there's 4 directions that I can attack Randy from. The difficulty being, of course, his internal organs are down. Now obviously you could attack into the kidneys or in the back of the head or things along those lines, but we see a heavy emphasis put on trying to get that heart. I think this is for 2 reasons. Number 1, that's a heck of a lot more fatal to get into his soft underbelly, quite literally. And number 2 is so that way the enemy player has to look up and see what has happened, and that's just all sorts of shocking. But either way, for our first one, what's going to happen is when we approach from behind, we're going to start off with a stab into the side of Randy's neck. Boom. We're then going to use this as a hook to turn him over, and we're going to follow through with a thrust into the heart. Then we move on to our next target. I really like this one because that first stab sucks. We flip him over and then finish him, basically. So here's that again. I approach in, I get my stab, turn him over, follow through with the definite gonna kill him, move on to my next target. Now from the front, we'll have to have Randy spin in place. Glorious, right? From the front, this is probably the meanest one out of all of them. And also probably the most practical, because obviously, if Randy is prone, he's probably either laying down fire on a particular position and or he's sniping. So this one, when it happens to you in game, is all sorts of shocking. But either way, I've come across Randy who's clearly not paying attention. What's going to happen here is I'm actually going to execute a soccer kick. So I'm going to just kind of drop into it, put all of my force into that boot, and just kick him under the chin, pretty much. He rears up by just kind of, in a realistic way, honestly, opening that body up. I'm going to chamber my leg back and push my thrust out. It looks like it comes in from the side. You could also do it from below since he'll kind of be reeling back into it. It kind of depends on how fast or fancy you want to be, but that combined with the initial kick is enough to put him out of commission. So here's that just a little bit more fluidly. I see Randy's lost. Boom, bam. And move on to my next target. Now, we'll have Randy go ahead and spin back to face the camera. Wondiferous. Now we come in from the right side. What's fun about this one is we're once again going to see we can take our dominant hit that we want to hit. Now this one, it seems to target slightly lower on the body. I think it's trying to get up and under the sternum rather than directly into the heart. But we do also see the offhand kind of used. It looks more like the hand just sort of hovers around the hip, but I personally interpret this more as I'm heaving him over with the stab as I kind of dig underneath the sternum. So what's going to happen is I come up, I'm going to crouch down, I'm going to drive my knife in underneath the sternum, flip him over onto his side, and just dig that all in there, extricate it, and keep moving. So here's that again. And like I said, in the animation, you don't see their hand close or anything along those lines. In fact, you don't even really see your left hand with this one, but you definitely do kind of see that lifting and driving as you're going in. But here's that again. I approach, in, drive, out. Now, we move on to probably one of my favorites overall, as I nearly took over Randy, right? Once again, I can't get the dominant side that I want to get, so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to approach. The first thing that the animation does is we put a hand, if not necessarily grabbing, on the left arm to prevent him from doing anything, which I think is a really cool detail. I would have liked to see more of it. It could also literally be they're reusing the same sprite for crouching down as they did on that side. It's just now I'm getting Randy's arm rather than his hip. Either way though, we're going to crouch down and lead in with a stab again into the kidneys or into the side. We're going to use that to lever him over, and then we're going to follow through with a dominant thrust into the heart, twist, he's done. So here's that again. Approach, in, pull him over, finish, done. And that's all of the knife takedowns versus staring at me. So Randy, you can go ahead and stand up. Now let's go over knife on end of stick, otherwise known as bayonet. So, fun thing about these. Now, what Randy and I are both using right now are our Mokutu Trainers. These come from Jukendo, which is basically kendo with bayonets. These are also still used by both the US military and the US Marine Corps, as well as probably other world nations as good bayonet trainers. Like, this hasn't changed for probably close to a century, but either way, these are approximately how long your weapons would be with a World War I era bayonet and rifle. These are long rifles. They're meant to be quite tall. They're not necessarily the most wieldy in trenches, hence why everyone started to resort to smaller weapons. Now, the other important thing about that is that you don't have grips yet. You do have a K on some guns, but you don't have grips like we know of now. It's instead just part of the stock. The reason I bring this up is because a lot of these animations, the hand moves off of the stock of the weapon and more looks like it's grabbing a grip that isn't there, as well as there is a sort of disconnect, this sort of shape, with a lot of these thrusts, which if I were holding a modern, or even like World War II era, assault weapon, this makes a lot of sense. If you have a handle, yeah, by all means, you can start using that flex of that wrist to get new angles. But if I don't, my stock isn't going to disconnect from my hand in the same way, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think what happened is when they did the mocap for these, they were using a weapon that had a handle. I don't know why. Maybe it was to accommodate, thank you, for all the different kinds of guns they wanted in the game. And to be fair, the only long rifles you actually see, with the exception of what like the medic class gets, are mostly for snipers. So you see shotguns, early SMGs, things along those lines with bayonets on the end of them. So I think it was to accommodate overall, but that hand is always kind of floating away, so I really do think they had a handle. But either way, when you launch an attack with the bayonet, what you're basically going to do is you're at your ready position, you will draw it back into kind of a high tierce, and then from here you're just going to sprint. Now, this is perfectly serviceable, and it also leads to a bit of hilarity, because more often than not, that charge misses, and Randy and I can quickly demonstrate that. So Randy's all ready to fight me, but he can't shoot me for whatever reason. I try to pull back and charge him, and he's just going to politely step out of the way. Shit! Right? And that happens way too freaking often in the game. But, exactly. When it does land, though, it really does get across that sense of impacting something, which I really appreciate. But for our rearward attack this time, I'm going to go ahead and have Randy face the opposite wall so we can see clearly. So coming off of our charge, what we're going to do is we're going to lower into what is essentially a low cart, so fourth position, and I'm going to execute my thrust kind of into the middle of the back from a slightly downward angle. Now from the first person perspective, it looks like you hit the high back. From the enemy's first person perspective, you can't really tell, it looks like more middle back, but from the third person, it definitely looks like it's going kind of up and under the shoulder blade, which is what I'm personally choosing to believe this being. But the charge is coming in, you land that thrust, which forces the opponent down to a knee. You then kick to clear. You then keep moving. So, pretty straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary. I mean, you're thunking into someone's back when you're sprinting at them. You could frankly stab them sort of anywhere. Now from the front, this is where the good stabbings happen. This one is probably my favorite to land, but the least realistic again, because what's going to happen is I'm running in with my charge, Randy's just going to kind of lower his weapons, and it's going to be just a high tierce hit. I'm hitting him into basically the middle of the chest. Your hand stays up like this, and from here the force of me charging would carry Randy onto his back, and I just stay on him. So we won't try to simulate that one because that requires him to fall over pretty hard. But again, it's just same sort of angle you were already charging at, land, drive, clear. Straightforward, nothing too crazy on the front and rear. It's to be expected. The side attacks is where it gets interesting. So, approaching on Randy's right side. This is probably my favorite one, right? What we're going to do is, rather than going in for his ribs or even his open heart, instead the high tierce thrust is going to be executed into the side of his neck, and this one hits really, really well. Their helmet almost always tilts over because their whole neck is bending, and you definitely get that sense that you just impacted a weak spot, which I really appreciate. But you land your thrust in, and then you just rip it back out. So here's that one again. Randy's shooting, I'm charging, into the side of the neck, clear, no problem. From the other side, the left side, again, can't get to the center mass good bits, but this time I don't need to follow up following my kidney stab. So instead what's going to happen is we're going to once again execute a low cart thrust, so you're turning your hand to the inside. But this time, off of my charge, you lower and go up into the kidney, and this one usually with some models, the bayonet will actually poke all the way through them. After you get that thrust in, you're going to lift a little bit before ripping it back out. I really like that one. It's very brutal to see it in third person, but here's that again. I'm charging in, up, lift, rip. Now, asking poor Randy to lay down for the final time. When it comes to the prop animations, this is definitely where we see that disconnect of the invisible handle more so than anything else. So the way you would historically, at least the way as for the manuals for the British Army, the way you execute a thrust against a low target is you would shorten arms. So I'm putting my weapon basically on the side of my arm and pulling it back. Sometimes it won't be quite as dramatic, sometimes it'll be on the weapon. And then from here I would execute all of my force going forward, leaning into it to drive that downward in a sort of corkscrew motion. But instead, since we got that invisible handle, what happens is when you come up on the target, so I'm charging, they will disconnect it from the body and bring everything down with this sort of arching angle. Which again, if I had a handle, that's not bad at all. So if I put my hand like I've got a modern handle, right? I'm charging, that's actually pretty easy to control and feels pretty good. But if I've got my hand on the stock, because I don't have a handle, that's pretty disconnected and I end up having to turn my weapon almost all the way over. And that's a very weird way to thrust, because if the bayonet is mounted on the bottom of the gun, now it's further away from me. If it's on the side, it's not as bad, but it's just strange, basically. And that's true of every single direction. It's always going to be you approach, down, rip out, keep moving. So, thank you very much, Randy. That was our return to moveset breakdowns, going over the knife and bayonet animations from Battlefield 1. I'm still on the fence as to whether I want to do the heavier weapons. So for example, the pickaxe or the meat cleaver, the Welsh blade. I do want to go over the clubs sometime because the club ones are just brutal, frankly. But I will probably save that for either later in the month or as just a little quick see sometime down the line. But for now, I really thought these were interesting, so I wanted to go over them in a bit of detail. And I hope you all very much enjoyed. So thank you very much, Randy. And thank you all very much for watching. Like I said, I hope you had a good time, maybe learned a couple things. I really like Battlefield 1, so it's a lot of fun. Definitely kind of wanted to play it right out of the Kingsman movie. But either way, thank you very much for watching, and we'll go over some other movesets another time.